This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome to this special edition of NC Spin. We are guests today of the Public School Forum of North Carolina for the very first of what we hope will be a regular tradition called Eggs and Issues. This show is going to be devoted to public schools in our state and how they can be improved. I am very delighted to have with me a very significant panel of people to discuss these issues. So let me introduce them to you. First of all, John Hood, Chairman of the John Locke Foundation, President of the John William Pope Foundation, syndicated columnist, regular panelist on our show. Beside him is Keith Poston, who's the President and Executive Director of the Public School Forum with a rich background in business, public relations, and legislative affairs. Next to him is Craig Horn, retired food service broker and entrepreneur who served in the North Carolina General Assembly since 2010. He's chair of the House Appropriations Committee on Education and vice chair of the House Education Policy Committee. Andre Peak is to my right, a retired executive with IBM, chairman of the NC Business Committee for Education, and co-chair of the state's Academic Standards Review Commission for the state. And beside him is Chris Fitzsimon. Chris, of course, is a regular on NC Spin, heads NC Policy Watch, writes columns for papers throughout the state, does a lot of speaking, and has been on our show since the very inception. The Public School Forum has released a list of their top 10 priorities for 2015. Obviously, in a 30-minute program, we can't cover all of them, but we would like to talk to some of those topics as we get started. The first is teacher compensation, recruitment, and retention. Craig Horn, you serve in the legislature. You've been making these decisions on teacher pay and teachers in North Carolina. I think our audience would be interested. As you are trying to decide how to go about keeping, retaining, attracting teachers, is the state budget the main factor in deciding what we're going to pay our teachers, or are there other factors involved in the decision making?
The state budget, available resources, is the primary factor.
Okay.
We're not going to spend more than we have. There are other considerations within that state budget. Okay, we now know how much money we have. We now determine, okay, how do we allocate that money? And we want to do so based on needs of the student first and foremost, and then needs of the system. But first and foremost, needs of the students. How do we get high quality, what do we have to do to get high quality teachers in the classroom working directly with the students?
All right. Andre, we've heard a lot of discussion about this pay scale that came up with and why we need to pay beginning teachers more money to be able to attract them. Is there any early indication of how well this new system is working?
Well, I don't have any specific data to share with you on that, Tom, but I can tell you that I believe that the focus is the right focus for us to have. Early on in a career, whether that be a teacher or any career, you want to make sure that you're paying competitively in order to attract the best talent, and you want to retain that talent. And by the way, the most spending that you have on training people and developing people are in their early career. So you want to, again, train, retain them.
Good point.
And I think that the focus that the legislature has on paying early career teachers is the right focus. Now that said, I believe we also have to address the long-term career, teaching career.
All right, Keith, you heard Craig talk about differentiated pay. This is a concept that has been fought and discussed for some years. NCAE and others have resisted it for a long time. Is it time to get to differentiated pay where we pay math teachers and science teachers and teachers that are hard to attract to the classroom? Is it time to do that? And if so, why haven't we?
Well, I think it is something that we need to look at, because honestly, coming out of I spent the last 20 years on the corporate side, and the idea of performance pay and differential pay depending on roles is something that I think a lot of people are very comfortable and understand. At the same time, talking to teachers, including my sister, who has been teaching for 19 years in Fayetteville, the idea of how teachers work together within the teamwork concept in a school is a little bit of a different factor for them. But I think that we already are moving toward, I would say, differential pay. I mean, certainly for the kinds of roles that we have, I think we have to look at the shortage of math and science teachers and middle grade teachers and special education teachers and think about things that we might need to do. And then, as others had mentioned, giving teachers different roles. I mean, we know that there are exceptional teachers who can lead and coach other teachers.
Well, let's talk about that. The concept of upward mobility within a classroom, it typically has meant in the past, Chris, for a teacher to become upwardly mobile, they had to leave the classroom and get into administration or some specialty in the
or get certification or get a master's degree.
All right.
We've done away with the master's degree even in a field, which I think is something the General Assembly ought to reconsider. I don't think this is that complicated. If you want better teachers in the classroom, you want them to stay, you pay them competitively at all levels, not just handpick some. I'm glad we gave starting teachers a raise, but how absurd is it that we have veteran teachers whose pay has been all but frozen since the Great Recession? They haven't gotten basically a dime, some of them. So you pay them competitively, you respect them, and stop criticizing public schools at every turn, which I think, unfortunately, we had a culture of doing that in the last several years. And then you support them, and that means you don't increase their class size, you don't fire their teacher assistant in the early grades, you don't cut funding for textbooks so kids go home and can't take a certain class in the mountains because there's no books in the class, you don't fire counselors, you don't fire school nurses. You support teachers and support them to help the kids. Teachers can't do all those things. We're already asking them to do too much, and now we're making them do more.
All right, John, we've talked about this before, but Amanda Ripley's book, which I think was just a great book on education, entitled The Smartest Kids in the World and How They Got That Way, says in her book that we are not getting the best and brightest kids into our schools of education, and indicates that perhaps maybe we have too many schools of education and that they're not preparing these students correctly. What's your response to that?
Well, when you look internationally at teacher preparation, there isn't one model. I mean, Finland does it one way, Singapore does it another way, Germany does it another way. So I don't think we should assume there is some easy answer on a shelf that the world uses and we're just going to copy that. We need to be specific to how our system works, but obviously we have to attract and retain the highest quality teachers we can. That engages the issue of teacher preparation. It engages, as we've already been talking about, differentiated pay by subject, by hard-to-staff schools, and for performance. We need to have a system, as has been said, where your best teachers, like, my father, I think, was probably a pretty good teacher in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg system. The only way he got ahead was went into administration, then became a principal. I guess he was pretty good at that, but that's not the. We need to have a system where excellent teachers can make substantially more money and not have to leave the classroom. We don't do that in other professions. We don't say, well, we have the best performing whatever, and in order to allow that person to develop as a career, we're going to take them out of what they're good at and make them a manager.
Craig,
it's not the right solution.
I want to go back to you for a second.
Sure.
As far as the legislature is concerned, there is discussion that perhaps we're going to change not just the amount of the way we pay teachers, but the way we go about compensating our teachers. And there's been a lot of discussion about performance-based pay for teachers. Number one, how would that work? And do you expect anything to move on that in this session?
I do expect movement on that in this session. Of course, as we said earlier, it'll be a bit constrained by what available resources. But there's certainly a mood and I think an acceptance, not just in the legislature, but across the state, that we need to pay high demand career field teachers more in order to attract and retain them. We need to be able to create a career ladder, career pathway, a career for teachers in the classroom, keep the best teachers right there, which is what attracted them teaching in the first place, working with the kids. We need to be able to attract high quality teachers to these rural poor areas that desperately need high quality teachers and have had a very difficult time attracting them and in fact retaining them.
Our state constitution and our courts have said every child should have the opportunity for a sound basic education. But until recently, every child was assigned a specific school to attend. Many have believed for some time that parents ought to have a choice in where their child goes to school. We established charter schools to give them some options, and beginning this year, low-income families were allowed vouchers to choose private schools for their children. I want to ask John and Chris both to comment on this question. This concept of school choice sounds really attractive. But do we really, at this point, we've been doing this now for a few years, do we really have any accurate data as to how these charter schools are doing, how they're performing, and who they're serving? John, I'll start with you.
I would submit that the empirical research of the last 25 years shows that choice and competition are an indispensable part of any successful school reform. It's not the whole story, and it doesn't have to be just the options you mentioned. Remember that North Carolina has a number of school districts that have used a variety of choice-based enrollment policies for many years. Winston-Salem, Forsyth, Cumberland County has that. A variety of systems have used parental choice. Charlotte-Mecklenburg introduced some systems. So choice is a concept that can happen within public school districts, but I also think there needs to be alternatives and options because I think that provides more innovation, and competition is good. There has been a recent study of North Carolina charter schools that showed that when you have charter schools in proximity to public schools, those public schools get better.
Chris?
I've certainly seen no compelling evidence that wildly expanding charter schools or voucher schools in local districts or in states around the country where the students have performed no better and in many cases have performed worse. But my big concern now about that whole issue is the lack of accountability in the way we're expanding. We just had another charter school close in Charlotte that one of the people who approved the charter school voted against twice. That school has now closed. Those kids are kind of scramble back to a public school and be half a year behind. And I think charters are here to stay, but they're supposed to be laboratories of innovation, not places where unaccountable things are happening with our tax dollars.
Another topic, Keith, on this same vein is the virtual charter schools. We all understand that technology has improved to the point where distance learning is a fact of life. Many universities are touting their programs in distant learning. Virtual charter schools we've approved 2 of them here. Are there any examples that you've been able to find where virtual charter schools are successful? And what are your concerns about them?
Well, I would say that at the forum we look a lot at the charters and that choice sector, and we think there are some great examples. On the idea of virtual charter schools and virtual schools overall, I think that's something that we ought to proceed cautiously on. But I think overall, we would look at things whether it's virtual charter schools or vouchers. As long as we have transparency and accountability, I think that there are things that we can do. As a parent myself, I like the idea of choice.
Andre, some years ago, the legislature passed a dictate that our community colleges, our universities, and our public schools had to do what they called articulation, in which they had to talk to each other, they had to share information with each other. Do we need something like that between charters and privates and institutional kinds of schools in North Carolina where they come together and share some of these best practices like Keith was talking about?
Great question. I believe absolutely. First of all, in business, the way we succeed is through collaboration within our enterprises and across enterprises. I mean, even the standards discussion we'll have in a minute is about collaboration, in my opinion. My son goes to a charter school, and it's amazing the things that they're doing here in Raleigh Charter High School. I would love to see some other schools be able to take advantage of that innovation.
Everybody agrees it's not unreasonable for parents, for taxpayers, for our elected officials to know how well our students, our schools are performing. Keith, I'm going to ask you, why have these school grades been delayed and what concerns have been raised about them?
Well, I think part of the delay has been the concerns that have been raised by the education community and others about the weight given to standardized single point in time tests. Right now, the current plan is that the performance grade, every school in the state, and that includes charter schools, every school in the state will have a letter grade, an A through an F, slapped on the front door of that school, figuratively. And 80% of that will be based on a single point in time test and 20% on how that school did over time. And the biggest concern for me, beyond the fact that that's a very crude instrument to sort of measure how well a school is doing, is that, well, then what are you going to do with it? I mean, you put the big scarlet letter, a D or an F, on a school that's struggling, likely to be in some of the lower income communities. But there's no plan to then
Well,
what do
you
you
raised a
do with
good
it?
point. Craig, I hate to put you on the hot seat, but
No.
what was the legislature thinking when they passed? I mean, you were part of the. No, wait a minute. I mean, seriously, what was the intent of this A to F grading system?
Well, the intent is to make it clear to a parent, or people moving into a community, how well their schools are performing. We use presently the School of Excellence, School of Achievement. Nobody really knows what that means. Now, it could be argued nobody's really going to know what the A through F means, but there's a better chance of that. I don't necessarily agree myself with exactly how this system was set up. However, I agree with the concept.
Andre, how important is it to businesses to be able to know how well individual schools are doing?
Well, it's part of our culture, our DNA in business. We measure everything. We hold everyone accountable. And we provide the resource and support so that people can be successful. That is, I think, the intent of trying to grade the schools even, is to be able to say, where are you falling down and what can we do to support you?
Chris,
I think
there's some feeling that this is the lower schools are going to end up being punished out of all of
Well,
this.
here's the irony. We've talked about early in this show how to attract teachers to schools where low-income kids are, where kids are struggling, get the best teachers in those schools. If 80% of the grade of a school is based on one test or how the kids are going to do, I'm going to go out on a limb and say the poorest school districts, I'm not picking on the county for any reason, let's pick a middle school in rural Robeson County. They're probably not going to do very well, so they're going to have an F on the door. And then you're going to say, oh, and by the way, teachers, we want you all to go down there and teach at the school that we just said was terrible. And the parents are going to, what is it, the experience in other states is parents overemphasize these grades and try to get their kids out of the schools, and the schools suffer even more. It's the wrong way to go.
As Representative Horn mentioned earlier, schools of excellence, schools of distinction, schools of supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, all the different categories, they mean something to the people who produce the data. And I mean, if you look at it, they're not meaningful information, let's face it, to parents. So obviously, something simpler is better. The bottom line here is that the 80%, 20% split is debatable and probably unwise. We should change it. But other than that, the system is here to stay.
American primary schools were once the best in the nation. We're told now we rank pretty far down the list compared to a lot of other countries, and maybe as low as 31st in the area of math. A lot of people believe the reason for this is that our curriculums are not rigorous enough. Tell us why. I mean, you serve on this Academic Standards Review Commission. Tell us why we abandoned Common Core and where this now stands.
Okay. Well, first of all, North Carolina has a history and tradition of leading in excellence in schools, in education in general. And that's our culture, that's our heritage. This feeling around the implementation of the Common Core is that we were no longer really leading. It seemed like we were part of the pack, and by the way, the standards that we had embraced were not rigorous enough. Now that is the perception. So what we did is we suspended the Common Core standards implementation in the state, and we formed a commission, which I'm co-chair of, along with Jenny Metcalf, for us to get to the facts and get to how we can change those standards so that they're more representative of North Carolina, more representative of what we're trying to do.
Craig, let me tell you how this feels to an average citizen.
Okay.
We have an initiative du jour, it almost seems like, in this state, so far as public education is concerned. We can't figure out how well one is doing before we start another initiative. Isn't that what's going on here with Common Core?
I don't agree that that's what's going on in Common Core, but I do agree that we have had policy whiplash, which is unfair to the students, unfair to the teachers, unfair to the system. We need to stay a course, no question about that.
All right, let's get to the bottom line here, Chris. A lot of people believe that we ditched Common Core because Barack Obama and the Democrats favored it. Is that true?
Well, I think it played a role in it, and it's interesting that Bobby Jindal and Scott Walker and Chris Christie and a lot of other people, including Jeb Bush, who still supports, by the way, the Common Core standards. It came out of a governor's group, not the federal government, but I think President Obama's support in this highly politically charged world and atmosphere we're living in, I think certainly led to a lot of the craziest rhetoric. I didn't hear it from legislators, but I heard it from some interest groups making claims that were just extraordinarily bizarre that I think sort of led people astray about it.
Keith, we say we want to know how well our schools are doing. We want to know how well our schools are doing in relation to other countries, but also in relation to other states. Do we really believe that having a curriculum for North Carolina that's different from, say, Ohio or New Jersey is going to be able to tell us how well we're doing compared to these other states, or should we have a common curriculum?
Of course, it's not going to tell us. I mean, that's I worked in in the 90s. I was in Washington D.C. working with some of the folks who were involved in the Nation at Risk. It used to be a conservative ideal to have high academic standards that you would assess on. I mean, that was what we wanted to have, and you wanted to be able to compare from state to state. I can tell you that the idea of having North Carolina math or North Carolina science that is somehow different than what we should be teaching in other states just doesn't, as a parent of a child in high school, doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I mean, I want my daughter prepared to have a job in any state and any country, and I think that we're going to make a mistake if we back off from the high standards. Look, there's some reasonable debates about Common Core itself, but the Common Core standards that were incorporated into our standard course of study are the highest standards we've ever had in the state, and we'll make a mistake if we
got to talk about testing. John, for most of the 16 years we've been doing this show, we've been talking about testing. And we've gone all the gamut of rolling our own testing systems. You have been one who's advocated using a standardized kind of across-the-board test that other states use also, so that we can measure how this performance is. Why is this such a difficult idea to sell?
Because people don't like what the test will show. In this particular case, you can't go backwards, you can't stay where you are. Okay, Keith just illustrated, in fact, the screw-ups with our testing program in the past demonstrate that simply repealing Common Core and going back to the system we had before is not an answer. Common Core itself has some flaws. The testing in particular proved to be very expensive, unclear how it was going to work. I like the fact that North Carolina has already adopted the ACT battery of tests for the high school performance levels. We need to pursue a similar course for K-8. We should not back off of end-of-year testing because we have to use that data to evaluate a lot of things, not just schools and teachers and so forth, but reforms, so you can evaluate what works over 10 or 15 years.
The idea was use the test as diagnostic tools at the beginning of the year, target kids who had troubles with tutors and after-school care, and try to bring them up by the end of the year to test the kids. What we did was we had the ABC test and we forgot all the support services, and the program sort of collapsed under its own weight because it's all based on having a pep rally before the end of grade test, which is absurd.
Well, obviously we can't discuss and handle all of the issues and resolve them all in one sitting on NC Spin, but we hope you've enjoyed this special edition. We want to thank the Public School Forum of North Carolina for hosting us at this first Eggs and Issues debate. Next week, NC Spin will return to our regular format of timely issues and balanced debate for the Old North State. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.